The desert sun blazed mercilessly overhead, turning the abandoned settlement into a furnace of cracked earth and bleached bones. Inside a rotting grain shed that had once served the long-dead homesteaders, 4 young native women pressed themselves against the splintered walls, their bodies shaking despite the suffocating heat. Misa, 19 years old, with long black hair tangled with thorns and matted with dried blood, clutched her knees against her chest so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The rope burns around her wrists and ankles had turned an angry purple marking where iron shackles had held her for weeks. Beside her, Taya whispered desperate prayers in Apache, each word splitting her cracked lips further until thin streams of blood trickled down her chin. At 21, she had been the basket weaver who supported her widowed mother and 2 younger brothers. But now her skilled fingers trembled uncontrollably as she tried to cover her nakedness with scraps of torn cloth. Anoka, the eldest, at 23, kept her fierce dark eyes fixed on the door, while her fingers wrapped around a rusty nail she had pried from the wall. Her Lakota pride had sustained her through the worst of their captivity. But even she couldn't stop the tremor in her voice when she spoke. The youngest Luta, barely 18, and still learning the sacred Cheyenne songs from her tribal elders, had not stopped weeping since their escape began 2 days ago. They were nearly naked, their traditional dresses shredded during their desperate flight through miles of thorny mesquite and razor-sharp rocks. Their legs and arms bore the crisscrossed marks of their journey, a map of desperation carved into their flesh. Blood from their torn feet had pooled on the dusty floor beneath them, attracting flies that buzzed lazily in the stifling air. The sound that froze their hearts was deceptively simple, the heavy thud of boots approaching the shed. Each footstep seemed to echo like a death knell, growing louder and more deliberate. Misa grabbed Taya's hand with such force that her friend gasped in pain. Anoka raised her makeshift weapon, though her entire arm shook with exhaustion and terror. Luta pressed her face against the wall, trying to disappear into the rotting wood itself. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door, followed by the ominous sound of a rifle being cocked. 3 weeks earlier, these 4 women had lived in different worlds, scattered across the vast territory, each following paths that seemed safe and predictable, until a silver-tongued devil came calling. Misa tended her grandmother's medicine garden in a Navajo settlement, nestled between red sandstone cliffs, where she was learning to identify healing plants and mix traditional remedies. Her grandmother had chosen her specifically for this sacred knowledge, saying, "Misa possessed the gentle hands and patient heart necessary for a healer." Taya lived in an Apache village near a mountain stream, where her intricate baskets were prized by traders who traveled hundreds of miles to purchase them. Each basket told a story through its woven patterns, tales of hunt seasons, and spirits that had been passed down through generations of Apache women. She was saving money to send her brothers to the missionary school, believing education would protect them from the hardships that befell so many native children. Anoka had married young to a Lakota horse trainer named Chaska, and together they dreamed of building the finest stable in the territory. Their home near the Black Hills was modest, but filled with laughter, and Anoka was certain she carried their first child, though she had not yet told her husband the joyous news. She was known for her fierce intelligence and her ability to gentle even the wildest mustangs with patience and understanding. Luta spent her days in the high country with the Cheyenne elders, learning the ancient songs that preserved their people's history and wisdom. At 18, she was considered gifted with an extraordinary memory and a voice that could carry the old melodies with perfect pitch. The elders said she would become a keeper of traditions, ensuring their culture survived whatever challenges the changing world might bring. The man who shattered their lives appeared in each village with the same compelling story. He called himself Brother Thomas, a traveling preacher who ran a Christian mission and trading post called the Broken Mesa Compound. With his silver-streaked beard, kind eyes, and gentle voice, he seemed like an answer to prayer for families struggling with poverty and uncertainty. He sought young Native women to work as domestic servants for wealthy families back east, promising excellent wages, safe travel, and the opportunity to send money home to their communities. To Misa's grandmother, he spoke of the healing knowledge that Eastern doctors might share with a bright young native woman. To Taya's mother, he painted pictures of the fine houses where her daughter's basket-weaving skills would be appreciated and well compensated. He told Anoka and Chaska that the position would provide them with enough savings to buy their own land and horses. To Luda's elders, he promised that working among educated Eastern families would give her invaluable knowledge to bring back to her people. Each family received a silver dollar as a sign of good faith, and Brother Thomas provided written contracts that seemed official and legitimate. He even brought testimonial letters from previous workers describing their happiness and success. What none of them knew was that Brother Thomas was actually Elias Gorin, and every letter was forged, every promise a lie designed to lure young women into a nightmare beyond their worst imaginings. The Broken Mesa compound existed, but it bore no resemblance to the charitable mission described in Elias's presentations. Hidden in a remote box canyon 30 miles from the nearest town, it served as a processing station for human traffickers who sold native women to brothels, mining camps, and private collectors throughout the West. The legitimate trading post was merely a facade. Wagons did come and go regularly, but their cargo was human misery rather than grain and tools. The compound's chapel, where Elias preached to occasional visitors about Christian charity and the salvation of heathen souls, concealed a basement dungeon where shackled women waited in darkness for buyers to inspect them like cattle. Guards dressed as faithful followers maintained security, while a network of corrupt territorial officials ensured that any investigations were buried beneath bribes and bureaucratic delays. For 3 years, this unholy operation had generated thousands of dollars in blood money. When the 4 women arrived at the compound during the late summer months, they were initially treated well enough to maintain the illusion. They shared simple meals with other workers, received clean dresses to replace their travel-stained clothes, and slept in what appeared to be dormitories. But the truth revealed itself gradually and cruelly. Their identification papers were confiscated. For safekeeping, doors began locking at night, and food portions grew smaller as their captors sought to weaken their will to resist. Women who asked too many questions about their promised employment simply vanished, supposedly transferred to new positions. The reality was far more sinister. They had been sold to buyers who paid premium prices for broken, compliant slaves. Judd Merrick had been hunting the coyote pack for 3 days, following their tracks across sun-baked hardpan and through rocky arroyos that cut the desert like ancient scars. The predators had killed one of his prize Hereford calves, a devastating loss for a man barely making ends meet on his small ranch in this unforgiving country. At 42, Judd carried himself with the weathered dignity of someone who had witnessed too much violence and now craved nothing more than solitude and honest work. His face, burned dark by decades under the desert sun, bore a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from the Battle of Gettysburg, where he had served as a cavalry sergeant in the Union Army. The scar pulled slightly when he concentrated, giving him a permanently thoughtful expression that made him appear older than his years. His hands, scarred by rope burns and bullet wounds, moved with the careful economy of motion that marked experienced soldiers and working men. He rode a sturdy bay mare named Dolly, her saddlebags loaded with jerky hardtack and ammunition for his well-maintained Winchester rifle. Behind them, a small supply wagon bumped and rattled over the rough terrain, its wheels raising clouds of fine dust that hung motionless in the still air. Judd had planned to resupply at the abandoned settlement before pushing deeper into the Badlands, where the coyotes had established their den. The settlement had been dead for nearly a decade, its residents driven away by 3 consecutive years of drought, followed by a series of Apache raids that left the survivors too frightened to rebuild. Now only the skeletons of buildings remained: a general store with its roof caved in, a blacksmith shop filled with tumbleweeds, and the old church that had doubled as a community storehouse and meeting hall. Judd often stopped here to water his horse at the stone well and rest in whatever shade he could find among the ruins. As he approached the grain shed behind the church, his soldier's instincts detected something amiss. A footprint in the dust, small, bare, and recent enough that the edges hadn't been eroded by wind. Then another and another, forming a trail that led directly to the shed. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle as he dismounted, every sense alert for danger. Rustlers sometimes used these ruins to hide stolen cattle before driving them across the border into Mexico. Claim jumpers were known to squat in abandoned buildings, hoping to establish residency rights before legitimate settlers arrived. Either way, trespassers on what he considered his territory needed to be confronted carefully but firmly, moving with the practiced stealth of a former cavalry scout. Judd circled the shed and noted additional signs of recent occupation, disturbed earth around the foundation, several drops of what appeared to be dried blood, and most tellingly, the faint sound of whispered voices from inside the structure. Drawing his Winchester and checking the chamber, he positioned himself beside the door and called out in the authoritative voice he had once used to command soldiers, "This here's private property. Come out slow with your hands where I can see them." Instead of the defiant shouts or scrambling sounds he expected from confronting thieves or squatters, Judd heard something that chilled his blood and immediately changed his entire approach, the terrified whimpering of women in desperate distress. Judd slowly pushed open the creaking door, his rifle lowered but ready for action. What greeted him inside made him immediately holster his weapon and remove his hat in a gesture of respect and peaceful intent. 4 young native women huddled together like wounded animals, their eyes wide with terror and exhaustion that spoke to suffering beyond his immediate comprehension. Their nearly naked bodies, covered in bruises, cuts, and the distinctive marks of iron shackles, told a story of abuse and desperate flight that Judd, as a veteran who had witnessed the aftermath of countless wartime atrocities, recognized with sick certainty. "Easy now, ladies," he said softly, pitching his voice to the same gentle tone he had once used to calm frightened horses during artillery bombardments. "Name's Judd Merrick, and I live about 10 miles south of here. I'm not going to hurt you." Anoka, who had learned during her captivity to read the intentions of dangerous men through subtle signs of posture and expression, held her rusted nail like a dagger and hissed with desperate bravado, "Stay back. We'll fight you if we have to." Judd took several steps backward, raising both hands to show they were empty of weapons. "I can see you've been through hell, miss, and I don't blame you for not trusting a stranger. But I give you my word, as a Christian man, I mean you no harm." He unhooked his canteen from his belt and placed it on the ground halfway between them, before retreating another step. "You look like you could use some water." The 4 women stared at the canteen as if it might be some elaborate trap designed to lure them within grabbing distance. Their lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Their skin had taken on the grayish pallor that indicated severe water deprivation, and their tongues darted out unconsciously to moisten their parched mouths. Luda, the youngest, began crying, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming emotional impact of encountering what appeared to be genuine kindness after days of terror and brutality. "It's clean water, not poisoned or drugged," Judd assured them, continuing to back away. "I swear it on my dead wife's grave." Misa was the first to move her healer's instincts, recognizing that they would all die of thirst if they didn't risk trusting this stranger. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, snatched up the canteen, and drank deeply before passing it to Taya. The water moved from woman to woman, each one consuming it with the desperate gratitude of someone who had been denied this basic necessity for far too long. "There's more in my wagon," Judd offered, "and I've got blankets you can use for covering. But trust, once shattered by betrayal and abuse, doesn't rebuild easily or quickly." When Judd walked toward his wagon, the women scattered like startled deer, taking cover behind the shed, and watching him with the hyper-vigilant wariness of prey animals that had learned survival meant treating every human as a potential predator. It required nearly 2 hours of patient conversation, Judd describing his ranch, his cattle, his daily routines, and his late wife Sarah, who had died of fever 5 winters earlier, before they would accept the wool blanket he offered to share among them. As the desert sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Judd built a small fire outside the shed, using dried wood from the settlement's ruins. He cooked beans and hardtack in his traveling pot, serving the food to the women on his spare tin plates while he ate, standing up his shotgun propped against a nearby post within easy reach. Through his field glasses, he could see the distant glimmer of lanterns moving systematically across the desert, searching the terrain in overlapping patterns that suggested military-style organization. Someone was hunting these women with considerable resources and manpower. "Would you be willing to tell me your names?" Judd asked, finally settling onto his heels beside the fire. The women exchanged glances, laden with unspoken communication. Anoka, who had emerged as their unofficial leader through a combination of age-fierce protective instincts and hard-won wisdom, spoke first with careful deliberation. "I am Anoka of the Lakota people. This is Misa of the Navajo Tea of the Apache and Luda of the Cheyenne. 4 different tribes." Judd observed his military mind, immediately grasping the implications. "Someone gathered you from settlements spread across hundreds of miles of territory. That takes planning, resources, and connections." Anoka's jaw tightened with barely controlled rage. "The preacher man. He came to our villages with silver coins and sweet lies about honest work back east. Good wages, he promised. Safe travel and the chance to help our families prosper." Judd felt a cold anger beginning to build in his chest, a familiar sensation he had learned to associate with encountering the worst aspects of human nature. He had heard whispers and rumors about missing Native women, but territorial authorities typically dismissed such reports as voluntary departures or simple runaways, seeking better opportunities in distant cities. Now he was looking at living evidence of something far more sinister and organized. "And this preacher," Judd said carefully, "can you describe him?" "Tall man with silver in his beard," Anoka replied. Spoke softly like he was sharing God's own secrets. Had pale blue eyes and a scar on his left hand shaped like a crescent moon. She paused, studying Judd's reaction. "Called himself Brother Thomas, but I heard the guards call him by another name when they thought we couldn't understand their English." Something about the description tugged at Judd's memory like a half-remembered dream that dissolves upon waking. The details seemed somehow familiar, but he couldn't place them in any specific context. 20 years of hard living had blurred many faces and voices from his past. Dawn brought immediate and deadly danger. As Judd helped the women into his supply wagon, covering them with canvas tarps and spare blankets, he spotted telltale dust clouds on the northern horizon. Multiple riders were approaching at speed, spreading out in a coordinated search pattern that demonstrated military-style training and discipline. "We need to move right now," Judd said grimly, climbing onto the wagon seat and gathering the reins. "Hold on as tight as you can." The wagon lurched forward with bone-jarring violence as Judd snapped the leather straps and urged his mare into the fastest pace she could manage while pulling their heavy load. Behind them, the pursuing riders had spotted their movement and were closing the distance with frightening speed, their horses fresher and faster than Judd's hard-working draft animal. The first rifle shot cracked across the desert like a whip, the bullet kicking up a geyser of sand 20 yards to their left. More shots followed in rapid succession, the pursuers firing from horseback, with surprising accuracy considering the difficulty of their moving targets and rough terrain. "They're gaining ground," Misa shouted over the thunder of wheels and hooves. Judd had one crucial advantage: intimate knowledge of this country, gained through years of hunting, ranching, and simply surviving in its unforgiving embrace. 2 miles ahead lay a box canyon with a narrow entrance that could be defended by a small force against much larger numbers, if they could reach it before their pursuers closed the fatal distance. A bullet whined past Judd's left ear, close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. Another struck the wagon's sideboard with a sharp crack, sending splinters of wood flying into the air. His brave mare stumbled as a third shot grazed her right flank, opening a bloody furrow along her hide. But the loyal animal kept running despite her pain and fear. There, Judd pointed toward a gap between two towering sandstone formations that rose from the desert floor like ancient monuments. Box Canyon ahead. We can lose them in there. The wagon careened through the narrow entrance just as their pursuers crested the ridge behind them, close enough now that Judd could see their faces and count their weapons. Inside the canyon's protective walls, he pulled up behind a cluster of house-sized boulders and began unhitching his wounded horse with quick, efficient movements, born of long practice. "Can any of you climb rock?" he asked urgently. Despite their injuries, exhaustion, and terror, all 4 women proved surprisingly agile, scaling the steep canyon walls like mountain cats and finding handholds in cracks and ledges that seemed impossible to navigate. Judd followed with his rifle and ammunition, his own climbing skills honed by years of hunting in similar terrain. From their elevated position among the rocks, they could observe the canyon entrance where their pursuers had stopped to debate strategy. Through his field glasses, Judd studied the men below, 6 riders, all well-armed with military surplus rifles, and wearing the rough clothing of frontier mercenaries rather than lawmen or soldiers. "Who are those men?" he whispered. "Guards from the compound where they kept us." Anoka replied, her voice tight with hatred and recognition. "The tall one with the white hat is Elias Gorin himself, the man who calls himself Brother Thomas." Judd focused his field glasses on the rider Anoka had identified, studying the man's face and bearing with growing unease. Something about Elias Gorin seemed disturbingly familiar, in the way he sat his horse, the gesture he made when pointing toward the canyon, even the angle of his head when listening to his subordinates' reports. It was like looking at a ghost from his past, but the memory remained frustratingly elusive. The pursuers ultimately decided against entering the narrow canyon where they could be ambushed and picked off individually. After 20 minutes of heated discussion, they withdrew to established observation posts at strategic points around the area, clearly intending to wait for reinforcements and trap their quarry through siege rather than direct assault. Working together with growing coordination and mutual trust, the group established defensive positions among the rocks. Taya and Luda helped Judd pile stones to create firing positions and cover, while Misa scouted for alternate escape routes up the canyon's back wall. Anoka, despite her small stature, proved surprisingly strong and determined, helping to maneuver a boulder weighing several hundred pounds into position to block the main trail. For the first time since their escape began, the 4 women were not merely victims fleeing for their lives. They were active participants in their own defense, using intelligence, physical strength, and growing tactical awareness to improve their chances of survival. 3 tense days passed in their canyon stronghold. Judd's mare recovered enough strength to walk without severe limping, and the immediate pursuit seemed to have withdrawn to a safer distance. But the constant threat of discovery kept everyone on edge. The women had found some measure of physical safety behind their rock walls, but they continued to regard Judd with deep suspicion that occasionally flared into open hostility. During a heated discussion about their next course of action, those suspicions finally erupted into direct confrontation. "Why should we trust you?" Anoka demanded, her dark eyes flashing with anger and fear. "How do we know you're not working with them? Maybe this whole rescue is just an elaborate trick. Gain our confidence, learn our plans, then deliver us back to the compound for whatever reward they're offering." The accusation hit Judd like a physical blow to the chest. He had spent 3 days risking his life to protect these women, sharing his food and water, tending their injuries, and standing guard while they slept. Now they questioned his fundamental motives and integrity. "I've done nothing but help you since the moment I found you," he said, his voice rough with hurt pride and mounting anger. I could have left you to die in that shed, or handed you over to those riders for whatever bounty they might pay. Instead, I've put my own life on the line. Then why? Taya asked quietly, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Why would a stranger risk everything for people he's never met before? Judd stared at the canyon walls rising around them, wrestling with truths he had buried so deeply that even thinking about them caused physical pain. Finally, he walked to his saddlebags and retrieved a small leather pouch he kept hidden beneath his spare ammunition and emergency medical supplies. From it, he withdrew a tarnished silver badge that caught the firelight and threw it back in fractured gleams. Deputy U.S. Marshal. The four women stared at the badge in stunned silence, their expressions shifting from suspicion to confusion to dawning understanding. I wasn't surprised when I found you in that shed. Judd said, his voice heavy with shame and regret. 3 years ago, I was sent undercover to investigate reports of missing Native women throughout this territory. The trail of evidence led me directly to the Broken Mesa compound, where I posed as a drifter looking for work while gathering information about their operation. He paused, unable to meet their eyes, as he continued. I got inside their organization, saw what was happening to innocent women, documented their methods, identified their buyers, and compiled enough evidence to shut down the entire network and arrest everyone involved. What happened? Anoka asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. When I reported back to my superiors with a complete case file, I discovered that key territorial officials were taking substantial bribes to ignore the trafficking operation. The governor, the territorial marshal, several federal judges, even some army officers, they were all profiting from the misery I'd witnessed. My evidence mysteriously disappeared from federal offices, my witnesses were intimidated into silence, or simply vanished. And I received direct orders to abandon the investigation immediately. He looked directly at each woman in turn. So, I threw my badge in my superior's face, bought that ranch with my savings, and told myself I was done with other people's problems. But the truth is, I was a coward who walked away, because fighting that level of corruption seemed impossible and dangerous. Anoka's expression had softened from anger to something approaching understanding. And now, when I found you four in that shed, it felt like God was offering me a chance to make amends for my failure. I can't save the women I abandoned 3 years ago, but maybe I can save you. Maybe I can find the courage I lost back then and finish what I started. The revelation fundamentally changed the dynamics between them. These women weren't simply victims of a criminal enterprise, they were survivors of a systematic atrocity that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. And Judd wasn't just a rancher who happened upon them, he was a man seeking redemption for what he saw as the greatest failure of his life. As the group sat around their small fire that evening, sharing the last of Judd's supplies and planning their next moves, Anoka revealed her own devastating secret. She had recognized one of their pursuers during the chase, a man whose face would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. The leader, Elias Gorin, she said, staring into the flames as if they might burn away her painful memories. He came to my village 4 years ago before he started calling himself Brother Thomas and wearing preacher's clothes. He told our people he was a legitimate trader looking to establish relationships with native suppliers, but he was actually scouting for women to steal. She paused, gathering strength to continue. He took my younger sister first. Awi was only 16, beautiful and kind, engaged to marry a good man from our tribe. Elias claimed he needed her to serve as a translator for other native workers at his trading post. She never came home. Misa reached out to squeeze Anoka's hand in a gesture of shared grief and solidarity. But I learned something crucial while I was imprisoned at the compound. Anoka continued, her voice growing stronger and more determined. Elias keeps detailed records of his operation, a ledger that documents every woman he's taken, every buyer he's sold to, every official he's bribed to maintain his protection. I discovered this by pretending to be more broken and compliant than I actually was, allowing me to observe him during his private moments. Judd leaned forward, suddenly alert to the implications. You saw this ledger many times. Late at night, when he thought all the women were asleep, Elias would sit in the chapel writing in a leather-bound book by candlelight. He recorded names, dates, prices, destinations, everything. After finishing his entries, he would hide the ledger under a loose floorboard behind the altar in a space he thought no one knew about. The potential significance was staggering. With that ledger as evidence, they could expose not just the Broken Mesa compound, but the entire network of corruption that protected it. Federal authorities who weren't compromised could use it to make dozens of arrests and shut down similar operations throughout the West. Getting that ledger would require returning to the compound. Judd said slowly. That's essentially a suicide mission with the place on high alert after your escape. But then we make it less suicidal, Taya said with quiet determination. We plan carefully, we prepare thoroughly, and we use their overconfidence and assumptions against them. As they discussed the mission in detail, Judd noticed something remarkable happening to these women. 3 days ago, they had been terrified victims fleeing for their lives, broken by abuse and trauma. Now they were warriors planning to strike back at their tormentors, displaying courage, intelligence, and tactical thinking that impressed him deeply. Their transformation filled him with both pride in their resilience and fear for their safety in the dangers ahead. Over the following 2 weeks, they developed a coordinated plan that leveraged each person's strengths while minimizing their individual weaknesses. During this planning period, Judd taught Anoka basic marksmanship with his spare Colt revolver, showing her how to load, aim, and fire accurately at close range. Her natural steadiness and fierce determination made her a surprisingly quick learner. The mission would commence on the next new moon, when darkness would provide maximum concealment for their movements. Luta and Taya would position themselves on the ridge overlooking the compound's western buildings, equipped with oil-soaked torches and dry brush, to create diversionary fires that would draw the guards' attention away from the chapel. These fires needed to appear threatening enough to demand immediate response, but not so destructive as to spread beyond control and endanger their own escape routes. Meanwhile, Judd, Mesa, and Anoka would use an old smuggler's tunnel that Judd had discovered during his original undercover investigation. This tunnel, carved into the canyon wall by previous occupants for reasons that remained unclear, emerged in the stone cellar beneath the chapel, where Elias conducted his false religious services. Judd had never reported the tunnel's existence to his superiors, instinctively keeping it as a potential asset for future operations. 2 weeks later, under a moonless sky that rendered the desert landscape nearly invisible, they implemented their carefully rehearsed plan. Luta and Taya took their positions on the western ridge, carrying torches wrapped in oil-soaked cloth and bundles of dry grass and twigs. At precisely midnight, when Judd's pocket watch indicated the agreed-upon time, they heard his signal, the low, mournful call of a desert owl, and began lighting fires in strategic locations along the hillside. The effect exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Shouts erupted from the compound as guards spotted the flames and rushed to prevent them from spreading to the stable's storage buildings and main trading post. The diversionary fires created enough chaos and confusion to draw virtually every available man away from the chapel area, leaving their primary target essentially undefended. Judd led Mesa and Anoka through the narrow tunnel, moving in absolute silence, despite the loose rocks and uneven footing that threatened to betray their presence. The tunnel emerged through a concealed opening in the chapel's stone foundation, bringing them into a cellar that smelled of dampness, decay, and something else, something that reminded Judd uncomfortably of battlefields, where the dead had lain too long under the sun. The chapel above them was dark and quiet, illuminated only by faint moonlight, filtering through stained glass windows that depicted scenes of biblical salvation and redemption. They crept up the wooden stairs with excruciating care, testing each step before committing their full weight and freezing at every small sound that might alert potential guards. The loose floorboard Anoka had described was exactly where she remembered it, hidden behind the wooden altar, where Elias delivered his hypocritical sermons about Christian charity and the salvation of heathen souls. Anoka pried up the board with Judd's skinning knife, revealing a hidden compartment that contained not only the leather-bound ledger, but also a metal strongbox filled with gold coins, paper currency, and what appeared to be official documents bearing territorial seals. "We've got it," Judd whispered, tucking the ledger inside his shirt where it would be protected during their escape. That moment of triumph lasted exactly 10 seconds before the chapel's main door exploded inward, with a crash that seemed to shake the entire building. Elias Gorin strode through the splintered doorway, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of the still-burning diversionary fires outside. "I was wondering when you'd decide to come back," Elias said, in a voice that carried the same false warmth and gentle authority he had used to deceive the women's families months earlier. "Deputy Marshal Judd Merrick, isn't it? Though I understand you prefer to call yourself a simple rancher these days." Judd's hand moved instinctively toward his holstered Colt, but the guards already had their rifles trained on him with the steady competence of men who had killed before and felt no hesitation about doing so again. "Hello, Elias," Judd replied, his voice steady despite the mortal danger they faced. Still preaching salvation while trafficking in human souls, business has been exceptionally profitable, Elias replied with a cold smile. "At least it was until these 4 bitches escaped and brought you back into my life like some avenging angel of the Lord." As Elias spoke, something in his voice and mannerisms triggered a flood of memories that Judd had spent 20 years trying to forget. The way he emphasized certain words, the slight southern accent that crept through his carefully cultivated preacher's diction, and the distinctive gesture he made when pointing, all of it suddenly clicked into place with the force of a physical revelation. "I know you," Judd said slowly, his eyes widening with recognition and horror. "Captain Ellis Gordon, 3rd Virginia Cavalry. You left my unit to die at Antietam while you retreated with the supply wagons." Elias's false smile became a genuine grin of malicious satisfaction. "Sergeant Merrick, I wondered if you'd ever remember, given how long it's been and how much I've changed my appearance. You always were too stubborn and honorable for your own good then and now." The confrontation erupted into violence without further warning. Misa crouched behind the altar and, watching the guards with predatory intensity, saw one of them shift his rifle toward Anoka and acted on pure survival instinct. She lunged forward, grabbing for the weapon just as it discharged, causing the bullet to go wide and shatter one of the stained glass windows in an explosion of colored fragments. Judd drew his Colt and put a bullet center mass into the guard's chest, the heavy slug spinning the man around and sending him crashing into a row of wooden pews. The second guard's hasty shot went high, splintering the wooden cross mounted above the altar and showering them with splinters and dust. Judd's return shot caught this guard in the right shoulder, breaking bones and sending his rifle clattering across the stone floor. But Elias had used the chaos to take cover behind the chapel's heavy oak pulpit, his own revolver now drawn and ready for battle. "Drop your weapon, Merrick," Elias shouted over the ringing echoes of gunfire. "Surrender now, and I'll make sure these whores die quickly instead of slowly." Instead of complying, Judd dove behind the stone altar as Elias fired the bullet, striking sparks from the rock's surface inches from his head. From outside, they could hear more shouts as additional guards responded to the sound of gunfire, abandoning their firefighting efforts to investigate the disturbance at the chapel. The building was now filling with smoke from the spreading fires outside, and burning embers drifted through the broken windows, igniting the dry wooden furnishings and threatening to turn their battleground into a death trap. Taya, seeing the gunfight through the shattered stained glass, abandoned her fire-setting position and sprinted toward the chapel to help her friends. She burst through a side door just as the wounded guard was crawling toward his dropped rifle, slamming into him, with enough force to send them both tumbling over a row of pews in a tangle of limbs and desperate violence. Despite his bullet wound, the guard was still dangerous, and they fought with the vicious intensity of people who knew only one of them would survive the encounter. Meanwhile, Elias had repositioned himself behind a marble pillar that supported the chapel's roof, using it as cover, while he tried to get a clear shot at Judd. The spreading fire was creating increasingly dangerous conditions, smoke that burned their lungs and reduced visibility, falling embers that ignited their clothing and rising temperatures that made the stone surfaces too hot to touch safely. "You cost me everything." Elias screamed at Judd, his carefully maintained preacher persona completely abandoned in favor of the rage and hatred he had nursed for 20 years. 3 years of work, hundreds of thousands in profits, a perfect operation, all ruined because you couldn't mind your own business and stay buried on that pathetic little ranch. But as he rose from cover to take his shot, Misa appeared beside him like an avenging spirit. During the confusion of the firefight, she had managed to circle around through the smoke and flames, moving with the stealth and determination of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required violence. She grabbed Elias's gun arm as he fired, deflecting his shot toward the ceiling and causing chunks of burning wood to rain down on them. They struggled for control of the weapon with desperate strength, but Misa's youth and fury proved stronger than Elias's age and surprise. She wrestled the revolver from his grasp, pressed the barrel against his chest, and pulled the trigger without hesitation. The blast echoed through the burning chapel like divine judgment finally delivered. The compound burned throughout the night, the flames spreading from building to building, until the entire complex was consumed in a conflagration that could be seen for 20 miles across the desert. By dawn, nothing remained but smoldering ruins and the blackened skeletons of what had once been a thriving criminal enterprise. Judd had taken a bullet in his left shoulder during the final exchange of gunfire, and Taya bore a deep gash across her forehead from her struggle with the wounded guard. But both injuries, while painful, were survivable with proper care. The 4 women immediately took charge of treating their wounds, displaying the same fierce competence they had shown throughout their ordeal. Anoka cleaned Judd's bullet wound with whiskey, salvaged from Elias's private stores, her hands steady and sure as she probed for bullet fragments and foreign debris. Misa tore strips of clean cloth from Elias's abandoned coat to create bandages and binding materials. Luda gathered medicinal herbs she recognized from the compound's abandoned garden plants that would help prevent infection and promote healing. Taya, despite her own head wound, helped support Judd when he needed to move and kept watch for any surviving guards who might pose a continued threat. They remained hidden in the familiar safety of their box canyon for 3 additional days, waiting for Judd's shoulder wound to stop bleeding heavily and for any remaining pursuers to abandon their search. During this recovery period, the women shared more complete stories of their lives before captivity. Not just the trauma they had endured, but the rich, full existences they had been forced to abandon. Misa spoke with growing confidence about her grandmother's medicine garden and her own calling to become a healer for her people, describing the ancient remedies and spiritual practices that had been passed down through generations of Navajo women. Taya talked about the intricate baskets she wove, explaining how each pattern told specific stories about hunt season spirits and historical events that preserved her Apache heritage in tangible form. Anoka described her husband Chaska and their shared dream of raising the finest horses in the territory, as well as the secret she had been saving to share with him, that she was carrying their first child and had known it even before her capture. Luda shared the ancient Cheyenne songs she had been learning from her tribal elders, demonstrating her remarkable memory and beautiful voice as she sang melodies that contained centuries of accumulated wisdom and cultural knowledge. These conversations helped transform them from victims defined primarily by their suffering into complete human beings with rich histories, strong cultural identities, and bright futures worth fighting to reclaim. Judd found himself genuinely invested in their individual welfare, not just as a lawman seeking justice, but as a friend who wanted to see each of them return to the lives they deserved. On the fourth day, a mail coach traveling the regular route between distant settlements passed near their hiding place. The driver, a grizzled veteran named Pete, who had survived 20 years of carrying mail through some of the most dangerous territory in the West, initially regarded their story with the professional skepticism of someone who had heard every possible tale of woe and deception. But when Anoka showed him several pages from Elias's meticulously kept ledger documenting the sale of native women to brothels and private buyers in towns, Pete knew well his attitude underwent a complete transformation. Jesus Christ Almighty, Pete muttered, studying the careful records with growing horror and disgust. I always wondered why so many young Indian girls seemed to disappear from the settlements along my route. Figured it was just the natural hardships of frontier life people moving on to find better opportunities. Never imagined there was something this organized and evil behind it. Pete agreed to transport them to the territorial capital where they could contact federal authorities who weren't mentioned in the ledger's detailed bribery records. The journey required 2 full days of travel with frequent stops to rest Judd's injured shoulder and allow the women to build their physical strength for the legal and emotional battles that lay ahead. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in the territorial capital was packed beyond capacity with spectators, newspaper reporters, federal marshals, and representatives from various native tribes who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness the proceedings. The ledger had proven to be a prosecutor's dream, providing ironclad evidence that resulted in the arrest and conviction of 13 individuals, including the territorial governor, 2 county sheriffs, a federal judge, and numerous guards, facilitators, and corrupt officials who had profited from human misery. Anoka sat in the witness chair, no longer the terrified, nearly naked woman who had hidden in a crumbling shed 6 months earlier. She wore a dark blue dress provided by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, her long black hair neatly braided in traditional Lakota fashion, and her voice carried the strength and clarity of someone who had survived hell and emerged with her dignity intact. The defendants told us repeatedly that we were worthless. She testified, looking directly at the remaining guards and facilitators seated at the defense table. They claimed no one would miss us because we were just Indians, whose lives didn't matter to civilized society. But they were wrong about everything. Our families mourned our disappearance. Our community searched for us, and now, thanks to the evidence we recovered at the cost of our own blood and suffering, the entire world knows the truth about their crimes. Misa Teya and Luda had already provided their own testimony during previous days of the trial, each woman finding her unique way to transform personal trauma into powerful legal evidence that moved hardened court officers to tears and filled the defendants with visible shame and remorse. Their collective courage in speaking publicly about their ordeal had inspired other victims to come forward, expanding the case to include dozens of additional charges and revealing the true scope of the trafficking network. In the gallery, Judd sat with his left arm still supported by a leather sling, listening to the women's testimony, with tears streaming down his weathered face. The U.S. Marshal Service had offered to reinstate him with full honors back pay and a promotion to reflect his heroic actions, but he had respectfully declined, choosing instead to return to his ranch and the honest, simple life he had built there. However, he had agreed to serve as a special consultant on anti-trafficking operations, ensuring that his hard-won expertise would be used to prevent future atrocities. During a court recess, Anoka approached him in the marble corridor outside the courtroom, her expression reflecting a mixture of gratitude, respect, and genuine affection. The prosecutor told us this case wouldn't have been possible without your courage and sacrifice, she said quietly. Judd shook his head with characteristic humility. I was a coward who spent 3 years hiding from his responsibilities while innocent women suffered and died. You four are the truly brave ones. You fought back when it mattered most, even when the odds seemed impossible. Maybe we all found our courage when we needed it most. Anoka replied with a gentle smile. And maybe that's what really matters in the end. The trial's conclusion brought satisfying justice on multiple levels. The surviving defendants received sentences ranging from 20 years to life in federal prison, while the corrupt officials faced public disgrace, financial ruin, and additional prosecution in federal courts. More importantly, for the long term, and the legal precedents established by the case led to new federal legislation specifically protecting Native women and dramatically strengthening penalties for human trafficking throughout the Western Territories. As the courtroom emptied after the final verdicts were read, a federal court clerk approached Judd with a manila envelope that had been held in evidence throughout the lengthy proceedings. Inside was a letter found among Elias Gorin's personal effects, written in his own distinctive handwriting and addressed simply to J.M. Judd read the letter with growing shock, understanding, and a strange sense of closure that he had never expected to experience. The document revealed that Elias Gorin had not chosen the Broken Mesa location randomly for his trafficking operation. He had deliberately selected it because he knew that Deputy Marshal Judd Merrick was investigating missing women in that specific area of the territory. The letter detailed how Elias had intentionally allowed Judd to discover evidence of the trafficking network during his undercover investigation, planning to use his former subordinate's rigid sense of justice and moral duty as a weapon against him. By ensuring that Judd would uncover the horrible truth and then experience the crushing frustration of bureaucratic corruption and official indifference, Elias had sought to destroy his enemy's faith in law, justice, and his own moral worth. The final revelation struck Judd with the force of a physical blow. Elias Gorin was indeed Captain Ellis Gordon, his former commanding officer from the 3rd Virginia Cavalry during the Civil War. The same man who had abandoned Judd's unit to Confederate forces at the Battle of Antietam while he retreated to safety with crucial supplies and equipment. The same coward whose betrayal had resulted in the deaths of 18 good men and haunted Judd's dreams for 20 years. Ellis Gordon had changed his name, grown a beard, adopted the persona of a traveling preacher, and built a criminal empire. But his fundamental character remained unchanged, and he was still the man who would sacrifice anyone and everyone to protect his own interests and satisfy his twisted desires for power and revenge. Understanding this connection explained the intensely personal nature of their final confrontation in the burning chapel. It hadn't been simply about protecting a criminal enterprise from exposure. It had been about settling an old score with the subordinate who had witnessed his cowardice and lived to remember it. The trafficking operation was merely the latest expression of Ellis Gordon's lifelong pattern of exploitation, betrayal, and casual cruelty toward anyone he perceived as weaker or more vulnerable than himself. Standing alone in the empty courthouse, surrounded by the legal documents and physical evidence of justice finally served, Judd felt a profound weight lift from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying for 2 decades. His failure to expose Ellis Gordon's corruption 3 years earlier suddenly made perfect sense. He had been fighting not just a criminal, but a ghost from his past, who knew exactly how to manipulate his guilt, shame, and sense of duty. The 4 women found him there an hour later, preparing to begin their journeys home to the families and communities they had feared they might never see again. Each carried a substantial financial settlement provided by the federal government, along with the knowledge that their courage and determination had saved countless future victims from similar fates. "Are you all right?" Misa asked, seeing the complex emotions playing across his scarred features. Judd carefully folded Ellis Gordon's letter and placed it in his jacket pocket. "I'm better than I've been in 20 years, he said with complete honesty. "Thanks to all of you, I finally understand what really happened and why. More importantly, I know that justice has truly been served." They embraced not as rescuer and victims, but as friends and comrades who had fought together against terrible odds and emerged victorious. Outside the courthouse, 4 separate wagons waited to carry the women back to their respective tribes and the lives they had thought they might never reclaim. As Judd watched them depart, each heading toward a different point of the compass and a different future, he felt a profound sense of completion and peace. The ghosts that had haunted him since the Civil War were finally at rest, buried beneath the weight of justice served and redemption earned through courage, sacrifice, and the simple act of refusing to abandon people who desperately needed his help. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains as he climbed onto his own repaired wagon for the journey back to his ranch, where his cattle waited and his honest, simple life beckoned. But he was no longer the same man who had once fled from his responsibilities and hidden from his past. He was someone who had rediscovered his courage, reclaimed his honor, and learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for glory or recognition, but simply because it's the right thing to do. Thunder rumbled across the desert sky, promising the kind of cleansing rain that would wash away the last traces of smoke and ash from the broken mesa ruins, leaving only memories and the satisfaction of knowing that evil had been confronted, defeated, and forever banished from a world that deserved better.